They signed her name on a mail-order bride form as a joke, her own sisters, laughing over wine while Nora did the dishes. They never thought anyone would answer, but someone did. A widowed rancher from Wyoming with rough hands, a dead wife's ghost, and a son who hadn't smiled in 2 years. Nora had 72 hours to decide. Stay where she was invisible, or ride west toward a stranger who might be just as broken as she was. She chose west, and nothing, not the land, not the town, not the man himself, was ready for what she brought with her. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one's going to take a while, and every minute is worth it. Stone Ridge, Wyoming territory, and a kitchen in Virginia where everything changed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Nora Whitmore almost didn't see it. She was elbow-deep in soapy water, working through the breakfast dishes while her two sisters, Celeste and Margot, sat at the kitchen table still in their dressing gowns, picking at toast and talking about a garden party they'd been invited to. A party Nora had not been invited to, a fact neither of them mentioned, and all three of them understood perfectly well. The envelope was tucked between a seed catalog and a bill for Margot's new hat. Plain paper, smudged ink, a Wyoming postmark. Nora's name on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Careful, deliberate letters, like a man who didn't write often and knew it. She dried her hands on her apron and picked it up. "What is that?" Celeste asked, not really interested. "A letter." "Obviously." Margot refilled her tea. "From who?" Nora turned it over. No return address. Just her name. Miss Nora Whitmore. "I don't know yet," she said. "I haven't opened it." She almost set it aside. She had floors to sweep and laundry to hang, and a list of household tasks her mother had left before departing for a week-long visit with cousins in Richmond. Tasks that fell, as they always did, entirely to Nora. But something about the weight of the envelope made her pause. She slid her finger under the seal. The handwriting inside was the same, measured, unhurried. "Dear Miss Whitmore, my name is Silas Mercer. I am a rancher in Conifer County, Wyoming Territory. I have a spread of about 400 acres called Stone Ridge Ranch, a son named Eli, who is 6 years old, and no wife. My wife, Clara, passed away 2 winters ago. I received your letter through the matrimonial correspondence service, and I am writing to say I am interested in the arrangement if you are still willing to consider it. I will be direct with you, because I think that's fairer than not being. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for a capable woman who can help run a household and be a steady presence for my boy. The work is hard. The winters are hard. Wyoming is not gentle to anyone, man or woman, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I am an honest man. I don't drink, I don't gamble, I don't raise my hand to anyone. The ranch is solvent and the house is decent. If that is enough for you, write back and we'll make arrangements. Respectfully, Silas Mercer." Nora read it twice. Then she stood very still for a moment, the paper in her hands, the sound of her sister's conversation washing over her like background noise. She had not sent a letter to any matrimonial correspondence service. She knew, before she even turned around, exactly what had happened. Celeste's laugh gave it away, a short, sharp sound she tried to smother behind her teacup, but it escaped anyway. When Nora turned to look at her, both sisters were wearing the particular expression she knew well: guilty, amused, and not quite sorry enough. "You sent it," Nora said. Not a question. "It was just a joke," Margot said quickly. "We didn't think anyone would actually—" "You signed my name." Nora's voice was quiet. That was the thing about Nora's anger. It didn't shout. It went flat and still, like water right before it froze. "You wrote a letter to a matrimonial service and signed my name." "We filled out a form," Celeste corrected, as though the distinction mattered. "It was ages ago. We'd had a little wine, and we thought, well, honestly, Nora, we thought it would be funny. No one answers those things anymore." Someone answered. Silence. Margot reached for her toast. "Well, that's unexpected." "Unexpected." Nora set the letter down on the table carefully, like it was something breakable. "You put my name out as a mail-order bride, as a joke, as something to laugh about, and you're calling it unexpected." "It was just for fun," Celeste said, and her voice had shifted slightly now, taken on that particular texture it got when she was defending herself, harder at the edges, vaguely exasperated, as though Nora were the one being unreasonable. You don't have to respond. Just ignore it. Just ignore it, Nora repeated. Yes. What else would you do? Celeste set her cup down. You're not actually going to write back to some cowboy in Wyoming, are you? The word cowboy came out the way Celeste said most things, with a slight curl, a faint coating of disdain that made everything she talked about sound a little lesser, a little beneath her, like the way she said sturdy when she meant fat, or practical when she meant plain, or bless her heart when she meant something she didn't have the courage to say plainly. Nora picked up the letter and folded it back along its crease. I'm going to sweep the floors, she said. She did sweep the floors. She also hung the laundry, cleaned the upstairs bathroom, and started the dough for dinner rolls, all while the letter sat in her apron pocket, getting soft at the edges from her body heat. That evening, when the house was quiet and her sisters were asleep, she read it a third time by candlelight at the kitchen table. Wyoming is not gentle to anyone, man or woman, and I won't pretend otherwise. She liked that. She liked it more than she expected to. Nora Whitmore was 28 years old, and she had been invisible for most of them. Not dramatically invisible, not in any way she could point to and call a single wound. It was slower than that, quieter, the kind of erasure that happens so gradually you almost don't notice until one day you look up and realize the world has arranged itself entirely without you in mind. She was the third of 3 daughters. Celeste was the beautiful one. Everyone said so, had always said so, and Celeste had built her entire personality around the fact, like a house around its foundation. Margot was the clever one, quick with words, socially easy, the kind of woman who walked into rooms and immediately understood their dynamics. Nora managed things. She kept the household running after their father died, and their mother became the sort of woman who needed managing herself. She cooked and cleaned and organized and quietly held everything together while her sisters lived their lives. She was also, as anyone who looked at her could plainly see, fat. Not chubby, not a little round. Fat, solidly, unmistakably, the kind of fat that people noticed and then decided told them everything they needed to know about her. She'd learned early that the world sorted women like her into a particular category, useful, perhaps, but not desirable. Capable, certainly, but not worth choosing. Good for labor and organization and being depended upon, but never quite, worth the effort of being truly seen. Her sisters weren't cruel to her exactly. That was the insidious thing. They weren't monsters. They were just careless in the way that people who have never had to think about their own bodies tend to be careless. Casually thoughtless, routinely forgetting that words land differently depending on who's catching them. The mail-order bride form was perhaps the most honest thing they'd ever done, even if they didn't mean it that way. Even if they thought it was funny. Even if they'd laughed over wine and never imagined anyone would answer. Nora sat at the kitchen table until the candle burned low, reading the letter from Silas Mercer one more time. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for a capable woman who can help run a household and be a steady presence for my boy. Capable. He wanted capable. She was the most capable person in this house, and everyone in it knew it, and no one had ever, not once, treated that like it was worth anything. The work is hard. The winters are hard. She thought about the dinner rolls she'd made that afternoon, the seams she'd repaired in Celeste's good dress, the household accounts she balanced every month so her mother wouldn't have to worry about them. She thought about 28 years of being useful and unseen. She thought about how this house would run without her, and how neither her sisters nor her mother had ever, not once, asked themselves that question. She got up, found paper and ink, and sat back down. She wrote the letter quickly before she could talk herself out of it. Her mother came back from Richmond on a Thursday. Nora told her over supper. Wyoming, her mother said, setting her fork down. Wyoming territory? Yes. With a stranger. With a widowed rancher who needs a capable woman. He has a son. He's been honest about what the situation is and what it isn't. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Eleanor Whitmore was not an unkind woman, but she was a practical one, and the look she gave Nora now was the particular look of a practical woman doing calculations. You know this isn't... Nora, this isn't exactly a normal way to. Celeste and Margot sent the form in as a joke, Nora said. I know that. He doesn't know that, and I'd like to keep it that way. Another silence. Her mother picked her fork back up. Are you sure about this? No, Nora said honestly, but I'm sure about staying here. Her mother understood what she meant. She didn't say so, but Nora saw it in the slight tightening around her eyes. The recognition of a woman who had, herself, spent decades in a life that was smaller than she'd planned on. When would you leave? 3 weeks. He's sending a train ticket. Celeste made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else entirely. He's sending a ticket. Like this is an arrangement, Nora said. Yes, that's exactly what it is. What? The 3 weeks passed in a strange, suspended quality, like the hush before a thunderstorm. Nora packed her trunk slowly, methodically, taking inventory of what she owned and what was actually worth bringing. Not much fell into the second category. 2 good dresses, her mother's recipe book, given with a pressed lip and wet eyes at the station, a set of practical linens, the small watercolor of the Virginia hills she'd painted herself at 16, rolled carefully in brown paper. Her sister's send-off was awkward in the particular way of people who knew they'd done something wrong and had decided that time passing made it less wrong. Celeste hugged her briefly and said, "You're very brave," in a tone that made it unclear whether she thought that was a compliment. Margot pressed her hand and said, "Write to us," and seemed to genuinely mean it, which was more than Nora had expected. Her mother held on longest, and when she finally let go, she looked at Nora directly, the kind of look she didn't give often, too honest for comfort. "Don't let them make you small out there," she said. "I won't," Nora said. She wasn't entirely sure she believed it, but she got on the train anyway. The train west. 3 days on the rail line gave her plenty of time to second-guess herself, and she did, thoroughly, somewhere between Cincinnati and St. Louis, when the landscape outside the window started flattening out in a way that felt ominous rather than freeing. She ate her packed sandwiches and watched the country change. The trees thinning, the sky widening, the towns growing sparse and then sparse again, and tried to build herself a picture of what was waiting at the other end of it. She had his letter memorized by now. She knew the broad strokes: widower, rancher, 400 acres, 1 son, honest man, doesn't drink. She knew the ranch was called Stone Ridge. She knew he'd been blunt about what he was and wasn't offering. What she didn't know was anything that actually mattered, what his face looked like when he was angry, whether he was the kind of man who said one thing and meant another, what his boy needed, whether the house was actually decent or whether decent was doing a lot of work in that sentence. She thought about writing out all her worries in her journal, but decided that would just be manufacturing fear on paper, and she had enough of the genuine article already. Instead, she watched the prairie unspool outside her window and tried to make her mind quiet. The woman in the seat across from her, a Mrs. Dalton, heading to visit her son in Colorado, had been watching Nora with the barely concealed curiosity of someone who'd decided the stranger across from her was more interesting than her book. She finally gave up pretending. "You're heading west alone?" she asked. "To Wyoming," Nora said. "Family?" A half-second pause. "Marriage." Mrs. Dalton's eyebrows went up, not judgmentally, more the way people reacted when they were genuinely interested. "Arranged?" "More or less." "Do you know him?" "Only from his letter." Mrs. Dalton was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Nora didn't expect. "My marriage was arranged too, 41 years ago." She smiled at whatever she was looking at inside her own memory. He was a stubborn, difficult, wonderful man. I still miss him every day. Nora looked at her. "Were you scared? In the beginning?" "Terrified," Mrs. Dalton said pleasantly. "That part's normal." Taught. Conifer Station, Wyoming Territory. The train pulled into Conifer Station on a gray Wednesday morning in late October, the sky low and heavy with the kind of clouds that meant business. Nora had her trunk and her carpet bag and her heart in her throat as she stepped down onto the platform and looked around. The station was small, a single building, a few horses hitched outside, a scattering of people who all seemed to know each other and to be looking at her with the undisguised curiosity of a small community encountering a newcomer. She smoothed her coat, squared her shoulders, and tried to look like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She spotted him before he spotted her, she thought, though it was hard to be sure. There weren't many people on the platform who looked like they were waiting for someone. He was tall. That was the first thing. The fact of his height, the way he stood with his arms at his sides and his shoulders square, like a man who had learned to take up his full space and didn't think twice about it. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He was wearing a plain coat, worn at the elbows, and the boots of a man who spent more time in mud than he spent thinking about his boots. He was holding his hat in his hands and turning it slowly by the brim, which was the only sign that he might also be nervous. He looked up and found her and went still. She watched him do the thing she'd been waiting for, the quick, involuntary assessment that people did when they saw her for the first time, eyes moving down and back up in the space of half a second, the small adjustment of expression, the recalibration. She kept her chin level. He came across the platform toward her, and up close she could see that his eyes were a dark, weathered gray, and that they were currently giving nothing away. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Mercer." They stood there for a moment, two strangers on a train platform in Wyoming, measuring each other with the careful honesty of people who didn't have the luxury of pretending. "I have a wagon," he said finally. "It's about 2 hours to the ranch." "All right. I can get your trunk." "I've got the bag," she said. "The trunk I can use help with." He nodded and went to get it. She followed and tried not to notice the people on the platform watching them go. 2 hours in a wagon with a man you don't know is either a very long time or a very short one, depending on what happens. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Silas Mercer drove with the focused quiet of a man comfortable in silence, which Nora actually respected, because she knew the difference between comfortable silence and hostile silence, and this one felt more like the former. She watched the landscape instead. Wyoming was not what she'd pictured, or rather, it was more than she'd pictured. Bigger in every direction, the sky an impossible scale, the mountains in the distance white-capped and startling. The road, such as it was, more a track than a road, wound through scrub grass and stands of pine, and the cold was different from Virginia cold, drier and sharper, with teeth. "It's beautiful," she said, before she decided to say it. He glanced over at her briefly. "Parts of it. The mountains. They look better in summer." A pause. "Less dangerous." "Are they dangerous now?" "Snow comes fast, sometimes faster than you expect." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have boots better than those before the first storm." She looked down at her feet. Her boots were perfectly good Virginia boots, leather, heeled, appropriate for travel. They were entirely wrong for this. "All right," she said. "I'll get boots." He seemed mildly surprised that she hadn't argued, though he didn't say so. "There's a general store in town," he said. "Mrs. Hanley knows what holds up. Don't let anyone sell you the fancy ones." "I wasn't planning on fancy ones." Another brief, measuring look. Then something shifted slightly in his face. Not quite a softening, but a slight easing, like a man who'd been braced for a fight that didn't come. They drove in silence for a while longer. Then he said, without looking at her, "Eli knows you're coming. I told him a week ago." "How'd he take it?" A pause. "Quiet." Another pause. "He's been quiet since his mother passed. That's just how he is now." Nora thought about that. How old was he when she died? 4. So the boy barely remembered her. Maybe didn't remember her at all, or remembered her only in the way you remember dreams. Shapes and feelings without specifics. "What is he like?" Silas seemed to consider the question like it was more complex than it appeared. "Horses. He likes the horses. And carving. I gave him a small knife last spring, showed him the basics. He's been carving bits of pine since." A pause. "He doesn't like loud noises, doesn't like when people make a fuss. He sounds like he has sense," Nora said. This time the look he gave her lasted a half-second longer. "He does," Silas said. "Smart kid. Just quiet." "Quiet's fine," Nora said. "I can do quiet." Stone Ridge Ranch. The ranch appeared out of a curve in the road. First the fence line, weathered but solid. Then the outbuildings. A large barn, a smaller shed, a chicken coop, what looked like a smokehouse. Then the house itself, set back from the road with a low porch running across the front. It was not grand. It was not charming. It was a solidly built, practical structure that looked like it had been constructed by someone who cared more about durability than aesthetics. The porch needed 2 new boards. The paint on the shutters was peeling in the corner nearest the chimney. There was a pile of split wood stacked against the south wall that told her someone worked hard and regularly, and there was a weather vane shaped like a rooster on the barn roof that told her someone, somewhere in the history of this place, had had a sense of humor. She liked it. She hadn't expected to. She'd thought she might feel despair or resignation or the particular hollow feeling of having made a choice that couldn't be unmade. Instead, she felt something closer to interest, the sense of a place that had problems she could solve, work she could do, edges she could learn. Standing by the wagon, she got her first look at Eli Mercer. He was small for 6, she thought, or maybe he just looked small because he was standing very still in the doorway of the house, watching her with enormous dark eyes that were a clear copy of his father's. He was wearing a coat that was slightly too big for him and holding, she squinted, a small carved horse. She didn't wave, didn't call out, didn't make a fuss. She just met his gaze across the yard and gave him a small nod, the kind you'd give an adult, then turned back to help with the trunk. She heard small footsteps on the porch steps. When she looked up again, Eli had come 6 feet closer and stopped. Progress enough. The ranch hands were 4 in number. An older man named Hatch, who appeared to be held together largely by stubbornness and coffee, a pair of brothers called Wade and Dell, who were both in their 20s and both possessed of the kind of casual ease that came from growing up doing hard physical work and not thinking too hard about anything else, and a 4th man who seemed to go only by the name Coop and who was the first one to make his opinion clear. Coop was maybe 35, lean, with the permanently squinting eyes of a man who spent his days outdoors. He was coming out of the barn when the wagon pulled up, and he looked at Nora with the uncomplicated directness of someone who didn't see any reason to be subtle. "Huh," he said. Not to her, to Hatch, who'd appeared beside him. Just, "Huh." The syllable carried a full paragraph. Hatch said nothing, which Nora would come to understand was his primary mode of communication. She climbed down from the wagon, steadied herself on the unfamiliar ground, and walked toward the barn with the air of a woman who had somewhere to be. "I'll want to know the layout of the property," she said to Silas, "when you have a moment." Coop's eyebrows went up slightly. Silas just said, "After supper," which was the most she was going to get, and that was fine. First night, Silas showed her to a room at the back of the house. Clean, spare, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked toward the eastern fence line. He set her trunk down just inside the door. "Sheets are fresh," he said. "There's a hook behind the door." "Thank you." He stood in the doorway for a moment, like he was about to say something else, then decided not to. "Supper's at 6. Eli eats with me." "I'll cook," she said. A pause. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'd like to. I need to know what's in the kitchen anyway." She turned to look at him directly. "Mr. Mercer, I came here to work. I understand the situation. Please let me do what I came to do." Another of those measuring pauses. Then he nodded and left her to it. The kitchen was well stocked and logically organized, which told her something about the man who'd organized it. She found flour, salt pork, dried beans, a ham bone, onions, and a half-full crock of lard. She found good cast iron. She found a pie tin and a sack of dried apples and made a decision. An hour and a half later, she put bean soup, cornbread, and an apple pie on the table. Eli sat down across from her and stared at the pie like she'd performed a magic trick. "Is that—" he started, then stopped. "Apple pie," she said. "Your father said you might like something sweet." He looked at his father. Silas's expression was unreadable, but his eyes had shifted slightly. Something working behind them that she couldn't quite name. "I didn't say that," he said. "No," she agreed. "I guessed." Eli looked at the pie for another long moment. Then he looked at her, a serious, grave look from a child who took things seriously. "I like apple pie," he said. "Good," Nora said. "Then it's a good guess." Silas ate his soup without commenting, but he had 2 pieces of pie, and he ate them slowly like he was paying attention to something. The first week. She did not sleep well the first night. The house had different sounds than she was used to. The wind off the mountains was not the wind off the Virginia hills, and she was far from everything familiar, and the dark out here was a different quality of dark, heavier, more thorough. She lay on her back and listened to it and took stock of herself. She had made her choice. She was here. The only way out was through. She got up at 5 the next morning and had coffee ready before Silas came in from checking on the horses. He stopped when he came in the back door and saw her at the stove. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." He got his coffee and went back out, and she made breakfast. And when the ranch hands came in from the bunkhouse, she fed them too because there was enough, and it seemed like the sensible thing to do. Hatch didn't say a word, which she was starting to understand meant he approved. Wade and Dell expressed their gratitude enthusiastically and in duplicate, which was charming in a loud kind of way. Coop ate everything she put in front of him and offered, "Not bad." From Coop, she would later learn, this was essentially a standing ovation. She spent that week learning the house and the rhythm of the ranch. She asked questions about the livestock, about the winter preparations, about what had been done and what still needed doing. Silas answered them in his sparse, factual way, and she listened carefully because he didn't repeat himself and she didn't want to ask twice. She fixed the 2 loose boards on the porch herself on Wednesday while Silas was in the far pasture. She found the tools in the outbuilding, found the lumber, and had it done before he came back. He saw it when he came in for supper, stopped, looked at it, and looked at her. "Hatch offered to do that," he said. "Hatch's knee is bothering him," she said. "I could see it when he walked this morning. The boards are done and his knee is resting. That seems better." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Not the measuring look he'd started with. Something slightly different, something less like calculation. Then he went inside. Small victories. She'd take them. Potter, town. On Friday, Silas took her into Conifer to get proper boots and to introduce her, as he put it, to people who need introducing too. She understood what this meant. She was a new wife, or close enough to it. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 weeks out. And in a small town, that meant she would be looked at and assessed and categorized by the community before she'd had a chance to establish anything else. She had been looked at and assessed and categorized before. She knew how to handle it. The general store was run by a woman named Harriet Hanley, who was perhaps 60, ramrod straight, and possessed of the particular competence of a woman who had been running her own business in a frontier town for 30 years, and had long since stopped caring what anyone thought about anything. She looked Nora up and down with quick, professional eyes. "The new one," she said, not rudely, just factually. "Nora Whitmore," Nora said. "Harriet Hanley." She came around the counter. "Boots?" "Boots." Harriet put her in a pair of flat-soled, heavy leather work boots with extra thickness at the toe within 5 minutes, which was exactly as long as it took her to determine Nora's size and her level of common sense. "These'll get you through 3 Wyoming winters minimum," she said. "You'll want to treat them with this." She set a tin of grease on the counter. "The fancy boots fall apart by March." "I heard," Nora said. Harriet gave her a sharp look, then something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "He warned you off the fancy boots?" "First piece of advice he gave me." She went behind the counter. "He's not good at talking, but he's not stupid." She looked at Nora steadily. "Neither are you, I'd guess." "I try not to be." "Good. Some of them that come out here for arrangements, they don't last the first winter. They're not prepared for what it actually is." She began wrapping the boots. "Are you prepared?" "I don't know yet," Nora said, "but I intend to be." Harriet Hanley put the boots on the counter. "On the house." "I can pay, "I know you can. I'm choosing not to charge you." She fixed her with a look that left no room for argument. "Call it a welcome to Conifer. We don't get many women here who tell the truth when they don't have to." The rest of town was less uncomplicated. There was a woman named Beverly Croft who caught them outside the dry goods and spent 4 minutes talking at Silas while looking at Nora in the particular way of a woman who has decided she doesn't approve of something and wants everyone to know it. She had a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a voice pitched slightly too high for natural conversation, and when she finally acknowledged Nora's existence, she said, "And you've come all the way from Virginia. How adventurous." with a little pause before adventurous that carried a world of subtext. Wyoming seems like it suits adventurous people, Nora said pleasantly. Beverly's smile flickered. We should get the rest of the supplies, Silas said, and put his hand briefly on Nora's elbow to move her along. Not proprietary, just practical. And Beverly Croft's eyes went to that hand and her smile went a little tighter. Later, after they'd loaded the wagon and Silas had gone to speak with a man about fence posts, a pair of women who clearly already knew each other stopped near Nora and had a conversation pitched at a volume designed to be overheard. That's the mail order? The first one said. Must be. A pause. She's large. She is. Another pause. Can't imagine what he was thinking. Well, he needed someone. Any port in a storm, I suppose. Nora kept her eyes on the street ahead. She had heard variations of this her entire life, and she had learned, painstakingly, over years, the difference between conversations worth answering and conversations designed to see if they could get a reaction. These women wanted a reaction. They wanted to see her flinch. She didn't flinch. She lifted her chin slightly, adjusted her grip on her bag, and watched a hawk circle in the enormous Wyoming sky overhead, riding a thermal with the effortless patience of something that didn't care at all what was happening 30 feet below it. Any port in a storm. She thought about Silas Mercer, who had been honest when he could have been kind and chosen instead to be clear. She thought about Eli and his carved horse. She thought about the porch boards and Harriet Hanley's boots and the apple pie. She thought, I am not a port. I am not an emergency measure. I am a woman who made a choice, and I made it with my eyes open. Then she thought, and I'm going to make this work if it kills me. She set her jaw and walked back to the wagon. Top. The weight of what was unfinished. By the end of the second week, she had a rhythm. Up before sunrise, coffee, breakfast. The house organized to a logic she was still refining. Eli, who had thawed by degrees, not dramatically, not in any single moment, but slowly, incrementally, the way river ice thaws in early spring. He'd started sitting near her when she was in the kitchen. Then he'd started asking small questions. Then, one afternoon, he'd brought his carving and sat at the kitchen table while she worked, saying nothing, just present, which she understood was the highest form of trust a quiet child could offer. She did not push. She let him come at his own pace and took what he offered. Silas was harder. He was not unkind, but he was contained in a way that felt practiced, like someone who had decided some time ago that it was safer to stay behind a wall and had gotten very good at living there. He was fair with her, consistent, respectful of her work. He occasionally said something that surprised her, a dry observation, an unexpected piece of information offered as though it might be useful to her. And she was starting to understand that this was his version of openness, that a man like Silas didn't show you things directly. He just put them in your path and let you find them. She found them. What she couldn't find was the grief. She knew it was there. She could feel the shape of it in the rooms of that house, in the particular way Silas moved through the space that had been his dead wife's kitchen, in the careful blankness he maintained whenever Clara's name came up, which was rarely and always briefly. The grief was load-bearing, she was starting to understand. He'd built himself around it and wasn't entirely sure what he'd be without it. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't try to do anything with it. Not yet. There were more immediate problems, like the fact that 3 weeks into her arrival in Wyoming, a well-dressed man with a silver watch chain and the particular smile of someone who was used to getting what he wanted rode up the drive and asked to speak with Silas about the property. She was on the porch when he arrived. He looked at her the way men like him looked at women like her, briefly, dismissively, already moving on to the next thing. Is Mercer about? He asked. He is, she said. May I ask your name? Victor Hale. Said the way people said names they thought should be recognized. I have business with him. She looked at Victor Hale for a long, quiet moment. Took in the quality of his coat, the cut of his suit, the calculation in his eyes that was working even when his smile was on. Took in the 2 men behind him on horseback, the kind of men who weren't wranglers. I'll get him, she said, and went inside. She didn't know yet what Victor Hale wanted, but she recognized the shape of a man who took things that weren't his, and she filed it away in the careful inventory she was building, of this land, of these people, of the threats that moved through Wyoming like weather, constant and indifferent. She'd deal with what she could, when she could. That was what she'd always done. That was, it turned out, what she was built for. Thus, the cold deepened that night. The first snow came before dawn, light, exploratory, the leading edge of something much larger. Nora stood at the kitchen window and watched it fall in the gray pre-morning light and felt the weight of where she was and what she'd chosen and what it was going to cost her. She also, for the first time in as long as she could remember, felt something that might have been the beginning of possibility. She put the coffee on. She got to work. Victor Hale left that first afternoon without getting what he came for, but he left the way a man leaves when he intends to come back, unhurried, deliberate, with the particular patience of someone who has never had to work fast because the outcome was always going to be the same. Nora watched him ride down the drive from the porch window and felt Silas standing behind her. The silence around him a different quality than usual, tighter, older. "Who is he?" she asked. "Landman." Silas set his hat on the hook by the door. "Been sniffing around the county for 2 years. Buys up ranches that fall into debt or dispute, combines them, resells at profit." "Has he made you an offer before?" 3 times. He moved to the stove, poured coffee that had been sitting too long, drank it anyway. "I've told him 3 times. "What did he say today?" Silas was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "He said the eastern water rights on this property are legally ambiguous, and he's had a lawyer look at it." He set the cup down. "Said he'd give me 60 days to prove otherwise before he files a claim." Nora turned from the window. "Is he right? About the water rights?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to cost him something. "My father filed the original claim in 61. The paperwork's somewhere. I haven't looked at it in years." "Then we need to find it." He looked at her. There was something in his expression she was learning to read. Not resistance exactly, more the reflex of a man who had been handling everything alone for so long that someone else volunteering to carry part of the load felt like a trick. "It's ranch business," he said. "I'm on the ranch," she said, and kept her voice even. "I'm not asking to take it from you. I'm saying 2 sets of eyes find things faster than 1. Another long pause. Then he nodded, once, and went to find the document box. They spent the better part of that evening at the kitchen table with a stack of old papers between them, while Eli sat in the corner whittling a new shape. She thought it might be a bear. And the wood stove put out heat in waves. Silas was not a naturally organized man, she discovered, which surprised her because the rest of the ranch ran with a clean logic. The documents were a different story. Receipts mixed with correspondence, survey notes folded into old almanacs, tax filings from the 1860s stacked with seed orders from last spring. She sorted. He watched her sort, then started helping, though he remained wary about it in the way of a man who had not decided yet whether to trust the process. She found the original land claim at the bottom of the 3rd bundle, folded twice, the ink faded but legible. She spread it flat on the table and they both bent over it. "There," she said, pointing. "Eastern boundary including riparian rights along the creek as surveyed." She looked at him. "That's the language. It's clear." Silas read it twice. "He'll say it's not specific enough. He'll say whatever he needs to say. But it's documented, it's dated, and it's signed by a federal land officer." She sat back. "He's bluffing, or at least he's hoping you won't look hard enough to know he's bluffing." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you know about riparian rights?" "My father had a property dispute with a neighbor when I was 15. I read everything in the document box, trying to understand it." She paused. "My mother thought I was being strange. Maybe I was, but I learned what the language means." He looked at her for a long moment across the table, not the guarded look, not the measuring one, something plainer than either of those. "You should have been a lawyer," he said, and it wasn't a compliment exactly, more like an observation made out loud that he hadn't quite meant to share. "Women don't get to be lawyers," she said. "No," he said, "they don't." He folded the document carefully and set it aside. "I'll take this to the county office Monday. Get it registered properly." "Good." Eli looked up from his carving. "Is that man going to take the ranch?" Silas started to say something as she could see the automatic parental reassurance forming. But she spoke first, quietly. "Not if we can help it, Eli." The boy looked at her for a moment, then back at his carving. "Okay," he said, in the way of a child who has decided to believe something because the alternative is too much to sit with. Silas said nothing. But later, when she was washing the cups and he was banking the stove for the night, he said to the room rather than to her directly, "Thank you for tonight." She kept washing. "It's the sensible thing." "Maybe," he said. "Doesn't mean it wasn't help." She let it sit at that. The real trouble with Conifer didn't announce itself. It accumulated, the way weather does, a degree at a time, a cloud at a time, until you look up and realize the storm has been building since morning and you missed all the signals. She heard the phrase for the first time at the general store, a full month into her stay. She'd come in for salt and lamp oil and been standing at the counter waiting for Harriet to come from the back when two women came in through the front door, talking. They saw Nora and didn't stop talking, which told her exactly how much they thought of her opinion of them. "She's been out there a month now," the first one said, moving to the fabric bolts along the wall. "Silas's mail-order fat bride." The second woman laughed, not bothering to lower her voice. "You'd think he could have done better. Out of options, maybe. Or desperate." "Well," the first woman's voice dropped slightly, more theatrical than actually quieter. "They say she does all the cooking and fixed the porch herself, like a ranch hand." "With those arms, I believe it." Nora stood at the counter and looked at the wall in front of her and breathed through her nose. She had been breathed through situations like this before. She knew what it cost and she knew what it was worth, and she knew that reacting, turning around, saying something, letting them see it land, was the exact thing they were hoping for. Harriet came in from the back room, saw Nora's face, and read the room in about half a second. She put the salt and oil on the counter without being asked, named a price crisply, and when the two women came forward with their fabric request, she said, "I'll be with you in a moment," in a tone that contained a full dismissal. When they'd finished outside loading the small wagon, Harriet said, "Don't let them make you small." "I know," Nora said. "I mean it. This town," Harriet paused, fitting the words. "This town has a way of deciding what a person is before they've had a chance to show them. Takes work to change it. I'm not afraid of work." "I know you're not." Harriet looked at her steadily. "That's why I'm not worried about you." It was the kindest thing anyone in Wyoming had said to her that didn't involve the practical logistics of ranching. She held it on the drive home, turned it over, used it like a smooth stone you carry in your pocket. Not because it fixes anything, but because the weight of it is steadying. The trouble with Coop was different. It was not malicious exactly. Coop wasn't a malicious man, just a skeptical one. And he'd been skeptical in the same directions his entire life, which gave his skepticism a worn groove. It traveled automatically without much decision involved. He doubted her because she was new, because she was from the East, because she was a woman trying to operate in a working ranching environment, and because, she suspected, though he never said so plainly, he had cared about the ranch before she arrived and was not entirely sure what her presence meant for how things ran. He was not mean to her. He was careful. He did exactly what Silas asked him to do, and not 1 inch more where she was involved. If she made a suggestion, he waited for Silas to agree before he moved on it. If she saw a problem, a fence post leaning, a sick chicken, a water trough going dry, and mentioned it, he'd find a reason to check it himself before addressing it, as though he needed to verify the problem was real before her report of it counted. She noticed. She didn't make it a conflict. She was patient because she understood the underlying logic. She hadn't earned it yet. Trust on a working ranch wasn't given for being present. It was given for being useful over time, consistently, in ways that mattered. She could argue the principle, or she could demonstrate the alternative. She chose demonstration. The moment it started to shift was unremarkable, which was appropriate because that's how most real shifts happen. Not in a scene, but in an accumulation of small moments you only recognize as a pattern later. It was Wade's horse. The younger of the two brothers had a bay gelding that had been off its feed for 4 days, moving strangely on the right foreleg, and Wade was worried in the vocal, slightly catastrophizing way of someone who cared a lot and didn't know what to do. The ranch didn't have the money to bring the vet out from the county seat for what might turn out to be nothing, and Silas was down at the south fence dealing with a break that couldn't wait. Nora had spent time in the barn. She liked the horses. They were uncomplicated in their needs and honest in their reactions, 2 qualities she respected. And she'd been watching the gelding for 2 days already. She went in, picked up the right foreleg, and found the stone wedged in the soft tissue of the frog, deep enough that it had been there a while and had started causing inflammation. She got the stone out with the hoof pick, cleaned the area with what was on hand, told Wade to keep it dry, and watched the leg for fever. Coop had been watching from the stall door. She set the hoof down and didn't look at him. "He'll need the leg wrapped tonight," she said to Wade, "and check it in the morning." Wade was grateful in his enthusiastic, duplicate way. She nodded and started to leave. "Where'd you learn that?" Coop said. She turned. He was still in the stall door, arms crossed, expression doing a complicated negotiation with itself. "My father kept horses," she said. "I paid attention." He was quiet for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms, which for Coop was roughly equivalent to bowing. "All right," he said. She went back to the house. Behind her, she heard Wade saying something enthusiastically to his brother Dell, and Coop saying nothing, which was still progress. What she had not expected, what she had not calculated for in all her careful practical planning, was Eli. She had expected the boy to be difficult, or distant, or both. She had prepared herself for a child shaped by loss who wasn't ready to accept anything new. And she had told herself she could handle that. She could be patient, she could be consistent, she could give him the time he needed and not take it personally. She'd planned for a long, careful campaign of earned trust. What she had not planned for was a child who crept into her heart sideways, the way cold water seeps under a door. So gradually you don't notice it's happening until you're standing in it. It started with the carving. One afternoon he came to the kitchen with a small carved figure in his hand and set it on the table in front of her without saying anything. She looked at it. A woman, roughly shaped, broader through the middle than his horses, with hair that might have been pinned up. She picked it up carefully. "Is this?" "It's you," he said, and went slightly pink, the way kids go pink when they've done something vulnerable and aren't sure yet if it was a mistake. She looked at the small carved figure for a moment. It was rough, lopsided slightly, the proportions working more from feeling than accuracy. It was also the most honest portrait she'd ever been given, because he'd carved what he actually saw, without the editorial adjustments people made when they thought someone might not want the truth of their own shape. "It looks like me," she said. He relaxed by a fraction. "I'm not good at hair yet," he said. "The hair is wrong. The rest is right," she said. "Can I keep it?" He considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old making a significant decision. "Yes," he said finally, "you can keep it." She put it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where she could see it while she worked. Silas saw it there 2 days later and went still for a moment, something moving through his face that he controlled before it finished moving. He didn't say anything. She didn't explain it. Some things didn't need naming. The ceremony happened on a gray Saturday in November, in the county clerk's office in Conifer, with Harriet Hanley and Hatch as witnesses. It was not romantic. It was a set of words spoken in a small room with water-stained walls and a clerk who had clearly performed the same ceremony enough times that it had worn smooth. Silas stood beside her in his good coat, which was better than his working coat but still visibly a working man's coat, and said the required words in his direct, quiet way. She said hers without trembling, which she counted as a victory. Afterward, Harriet produced a bottle of something and poured 4 small glasses, and Hatch drank his in one motion and set the glass down, and that was the celebration. On the drive home, Eli sat between them on the wagon seat and fell asleep leaning against her arm, his weight small and warm and absolute. She did not look at Silas. She was afraid if she did, she'd see something too complicated to manage, and she needed to stay steady. She looked at the mountains instead. The snow had settled on them properly now, heavy and permanent looking, and the sky above was the dark blue of late afternoon in the high country. Beautiful in the way of things that could also kill you if you weren't careful, which was something she was learning was very Wyoming. "Eli likes you," Silas said, not looking at her either. "I like him," she said. "That's—" He paused. "That's good. For him. He doesn't warm up to people easily." I noticed. The wagon wheels creaked over a frozen rut. The horses moved steadily ahead. "He carved that figure for you," Silas said. "He's only ever carved horses before." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She watched the mountains and let the silence be what it was. Not empty, not full, somewhere in between. The particular silence of two people who were learning the shape of each other without quite knowing yet whether what they were building was something real or just the useful illusion of something real. When they got back to Stone Ridge, the ranch hands had put a lantern on the porch, and its light sat in the dark yard like a small, stubborn claim against the early night. She looked at it and felt something she hadn't felt since before she got on the train in Virginia. Not happiness exactly, not yet, not with this much still uncertain, but the quieter thing underneath happiness, the sense that she was somewhere that required her to be her whole self. She had been in smaller spaces for most of her life. This one had room. She helped Eli down from the wagon and walked him inside to get him ready for sleep. And behind her she heard Silas unhitch the horses, talking to them in the low, even voice he used when he thought no one was listening. The same voice, she realized, that he used with his son on the rare occasions he forgot to be guarded. It was a good voice. She had noticed it before. She filed it away with the other things she was noticing and told herself not to make too much of any of them. Not yet. There was still too much that could go wrong. December came in hard, the way Wyoming winters do. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like a door slammed shut. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single night and stayed there, and Nora learned what Silas had meant when he said the cold here had teeth. It was not the wet, heavy cold of Virginia winters. It was dry and absolute, the kind that got into the gaps of a building and found every place where the insulation wasn't quite enough, every window frame that had settled slightly, every door that didn't hang quite square. She stuffed rags into the worst gaps and hung an extra blanket over Eli's window and added a second pot of beans to the stove rotation because the ranch hands were burning more calories just staying warm and needed the food. She was learning the ranch the way you learn a language by living inside it, not from a book, not from being taught, but from daily necessity, from making mistakes and correcting them, from paying attention to what the animals and the land and the weather were telling her before she knew enough to ask the right questions. She learned that the south pasture drained badly and flooded the fence line when the snowmelt ran fast. She learned that Hatch's bad knee predicted weather changes more reliably than the almanac, that Wade's horse needed to be kept moving in cold or he'd stiffen up, that the chickens stopped laying when the temperature dropped below a certain threshold, and there was nothing to be done about it except wait. She learned Silas, too. Slowly, imperfectly, the way you learn anything complicated. He was a man of patterns. Up before anyone, to the barn first, then coffee, then the day's work organized in his head before he'd spoken a word to anyone. He thought out loud rarely and felt things silently and deeply, which meant the distance between his interior life and what he showed you was significant, and you had to learn to read the gap. She was getting better at it. She could tell when something was bothering him by the set of his jaw and the way he held his coffee cup, tighter, like he needed something to hold on to. She could tell when he was satisfied with a day's work by a slight loosening around his eyes. She could tell, though she would not have said this out loud to anyone, when he was looking at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She didn't know what to do with that last one, so she filed it and kept working. What she could not read, not yet, not fully, was the grief. It moved through the house like weather, present but formless, showing up in unexpected places. A photograph on the mantel she'd never seen him look at directly. A quilt on the chest at the foot of the master bed that was clearly handmade and never used. Eli asking her once, with the careful casualness of a child testing territory, "My mama used to make biscuits. Do you know how to make biscuits?" She'd said yes, and made them. And Eli ate 4 and didn't say anything about whether they were the same, and she didn't ask. Some comparisons weren't hers to know the result of. It was Hatch who told her about Clara. Not deliberately. Hatch was not a man who told you things deliberately. It came out one afternoon when they were both in the barn, she checking on the chickens she'd moved inside against the cold, him patching a section of stall wall, and he started talking in his spare way, not quite to her, but not quite to himself either. She was a good woman, he said, without preamble, and Nora understood who he meant. Hard as this country, but good. Silas, he stopped, fitted a board, kept going. He built this whole place around her being in it. When she went, he didn't know what to do with any of it. The ranch, you mean? The ranch. The boy. Himself. Hatch drove a nail, unhurried. He kept everything running, but he stopped knowing why he was running it. You understand what I mean. She did. He needs a reason. He needs to let himself have one. He drove another nail. That's the harder part. She thought about that for a long time afterward. Victor Hale came back on the 15th of December, and this time he brought his lawyer. She saw them from the kitchen window. 3 horses, 2 men she recognized and one she didn't. A thin man in a town coat with a leather satchel who moved like someone who spent his life in offices and was slightly uncomfortable outdoors. She had coffee on and was making bread, and she took her time wiping her hands on her apron before she went to the door. Silas had already come in from the far barn by the time she got to the porch. Coop must have spotted them and sent word, because he appeared from around the side of the house with the particular expression of a man who had been expecting this and was not pleased but was not surprised. He stopped beside her on the porch without saying anything. She stood just behind his shoulder. Hale tipped his hat to her with his usual practiced courtesy. "Mrs. Mercer." "Mr. Hale." She kept her voice flat and pleasant, the tone she used when she needed to sound agreeable without giving anything away. "Cold day for a ride. Business doesn't keep to warm weather, unfortunately." He looked at Silas. "I believe you've had time to look into the matter we discussed." "I have." Silas's voice was controlled. "I registered the original land claim with the county office 3 weeks ago. The water rights are documented and clear." The lawyer, Hale introduced him as a Mr. Birch, opened his satchel with the slightly theatrical movements of a man who knew what was coming and wanted the audience to watch. He produced a set of papers and stepped forward. "Mr. Mercer, what you've registered is the original filing, which is not in dispute. What is in dispute is the secondary survey conducted in 1874 that redrew the eastern boundary of this parcel by approximately 40 feet, which places the creek, and therefore the water rights, outside your property line as currently surveyed. Silas went still. The controlled kind of still that was different from his ordinary quiet. This was the stillness of someone absorbing a blow. There was no secondary survey. "I have the documentation." Birch held out the papers. Nora said from behind Silas's shoulder, "May I see that?" Birch looked at her with the mild surprise of a man who had not expected that request from that direction. Hale's expression shifted fractionally, something tightening in it. But the lawyer, after a half-second's hesitation, held the papers toward her. She took them, read them again, more slowly, feeling the shape of the language, the way certain phrases sat in it. "This survey is dated June of 1874, she said. "That's correct," Birch said. "Your office prepared this document?" "On behalf of my client, yes." "Then your client's office prepared a document dated June of 1874 that references a survey instrument model that wasn't manufactured until 1879. She looked up. "I know because my father's land dispute involved a similar document, and we learned, the hard way, to check the instrument references against production records." She handed the papers back to Birch with the care of someone returning something they don't want to be responsible for. "You might want to advise your client about the legal consequences of submitting a falsified survey to a county land office." The silence that followed had texture to it. Birch looked at the papers, then at Hale, a look that said quite clearly he had not known this and was not happy about the position he was now in. Hale's face had gone very still, the practiced pleasantness locked in place like a mask that was working harder than usual. "That's a serious accusation," Hale said, his voice level. "It's an observation," Nora said, "about the instrument reference. The accusation would be up to the county land office." Silas looked at her. She kept her eyes on Hale. Hale looked at her for a long moment with the focused attention of a man revising his assessment of a situation. Then he smiled, the real one this time, or the closest he came to it, which was not warm but was at least honest. "You're smarter than I expected, Mrs. Mercer." "Most people are," she said. He gathered himself, unhurried, the way a man does when he is retreating but wants to make clear that retreating is his choice. "We'll be in touch," he said, and turned his horse. She watched them ride down the drive until they were small in the distance, and her hands, which she'd kept very still through the entire conversation, were shaking slightly. She put them in her apron pockets. Coop said, from somewhere to her left, "Well?" She didn't respond. Silas turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen from him before. Open in a way he usually kept closed, complicated with something she couldn't fully name. "How did you know?" he said. "About the instrument." "I told you. My father's dispute." "You remembered the year a specific survey instrument was manufactured." "I remember useful things." She moved toward the door. "But we should eat. It's almost noon." She went inside before he could say anything else, because she needed a moment where no one was looking at her. She stood at the kitchen counter and breathed until her hands steadied. Outside, she could hear Coop saying something to Silas in a low voice, and Silas not responding, and then footsteps on the porch. He came in and poured coffee and stood at the kitchen table. "He'll try again," he said. "Yes. He's not a man who quits." "No. But he's also a man who prefers the path of least resistance. We made this one difficult." She started cutting bread. "If we make the next one difficult too, eventually it becomes easier for him to find another target." Silas was quiet. "You keep saying we." She stopped cutting and looked at him. "Is that a problem?" He looked back at her. The kitchen was warm, the stove working hard, and outside the December cold pressed against the windows with its steady, indifferent weight. He had the coffee cup in his hand, turning it slightly, the same thing he'd been doing the day she arrived on the platform in Conifer. The tell she hadn't known then was a tell. "No," he said. "It's not a problem." She went back to cutting bread. She found out about the money from Hatch, again, which told her something about how information moved on Stone Ridge Ranch, not through direct conversation, but through the ranch's long memory, the accumulated knowledge of an old man who had been there since the beginning. The cattle yield from autumn had been low, a bad grazing season, a sickness that had moved through the herd in September and taken 11 head before Silas and the hands got it under control. 11 head was a significant loss on a ranch this size. Combined with an equipment repair in the spring and the cost of the extra feed the cold winter was demanding, the ranch was operating on margins that made Nora's chest tight when she thought about them clearly. She thought about them at 3 in the morning, which was when the thoughts she'd managed to hold off during the day got through her defenses. She lay in her room and stared at the ceiling and did arithmetic in her head. She knew what the household cost to run weekly. She knew roughly what the hands earned. She knew what feed was running at current prices from Harriet's store. She was good at arithmetic. She'd been doing the Whitmore household account since she was 19. And the numbers she was doing now did not have a comfortable conclusion. If they had another difficult quarter, or if Hale found a legal angle that stuck and forced them into a court fight, or if the spring cattle yield didn't substantially recover, they would be exactly the kind of ranch that Victor Hale could pick up for half its value from a family that had run out of options. She got up at 4 instead of 5, found paper, and started writing down what she knew in organized columns, the way her father had taught her. Income, fixed expenses, variable costs, the gap between them. She was still sitting there when Silas came in for his pre-dawn coffee and stopped at the sight of her and the papers. "Couldn't sleep," she said, before he asked. He looked at the papers. Something moved across his face. A complicated thing, pride tangled with defensiveness, which she was coming to understand was how he reacted to anything that touched the ranch's financial vulnerability. He set his coffee down and looked at the columns she'd made. "Where'd you get those numbers?" he asked. "The account ledger in the study. You left it out after the Hale visit." She looked up at him. "I should have asked. I'm sorry, but I needed to understand what we're working with." The defensiveness won for a moment. "That's..." He stopped, looked at the ledger, at her columns, at the numbers she'd written clearly in a way that made them inescapable. His jaw tightened. "It's not as bad as it looks." "I know. I accounted for the spring optimistically in column 3. She turned the paper so he could see it better. "If the yield recovers by 30%, which is reasonable given the herd's health now, and if we cut the discretionary supply costs here and here, there's room to build a buffer before fall." She paused. "But we'd need to do both." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He had not planned to. She could see that, the way it happened as though the decision made itself. He looked at the papers properly for the first time, the way a man looks at something when he's decided to see it rather than manage his reaction to it. "The Hendersons have been wanting to buy our excess hay," he said after a while. "I didn't know that." Told them no last fall because I thought we'd need it. But the way the winter's running, he turned the paper slightly toward himself. Hay prices are high. If this cold keeps up, they'll be higher. So we sell the excess now, at current prices, instead of holding. Before we know if we need it. If we need it, we can buy from the county supply. It'll cost more, but not as much as what we'd get for the hay now. She watched him think it through. This was one of the things she was learning about him. He was careful, methodical, not impulsive, and he needed to travel the logic himself rather than be pulled through it. She could give him the path, but she had to let him walk it. That makes sense, he said finally. He didn't say it like a man admitting something. He said it like a man who'd reached a conclusion. I'll talk to Henderson this week. She started to fold the papers up. He put his hand on them, briefly, stopping her. Keep working on this, he said, if you want to. She looked at his hand on the papers, then at him. I want to, she said. He took his hand back and picked up his coffee. The fire started on a Thursday night in January. She smelled it before she heard anything. A thread of smoke working under the back door. Not the ordinary smell of the wood stove, but something different, wilder, with a chemical edge that snapped her awake from the light sleep she'd been in. She was on her feet and in the hallway before her mind had fully assembled what her body already knew. Orange light in the yard, visible from the window at the end of the hall, coming from the barn. She hit Silas's door with the flat of her hand. Barn's on fire, she said, and didn't wait for an answer, heading for Eli's room next. The boy was already awake, sitting up in bed, eyes wide and dark. Come with me, she said. Right now. Put your boots on. She helped him into his coat with hands that were fast and steady in the way that hands sometimes get in an emergency, all the shock going somewhere else while the body does what needs doing. She got him to the kitchen and looked him straight in the eyes. Sit in that chair and do not go outside, she said. Do you understand me? The barn is being handled. Your job is to stay here, yes? He swallowed. Yes. She grabbed her own coat and boots and went out the back door into the bitter January night. The barn was burning on the east side, one wall fully involved, the fire working upward in the hungry, focused way of a fire that has been burning longer than it looks like from a distance. Silas and Coop were already there, Coop working the pump handle while Silas managed the hose, and Wade and Dell were inside the barn getting the horses out. She could hear the animals screaming and the men shouting over the roar of the fire. She ran to the pump and took over from Coop without being asked. Get the horses, she said. They need another set of hands. He went without argument. She pumped, arms driving the handle in a rhythm, and watched Silas work the water on the base of the flame, trying to hold the line at the eastern wall and keep it from spreading to the center of the structure. Her shoulders burned. She kept pumping. It took 2 hours. By the time they got it down to smoldering, the eastern wall was a loss and part of the roof had come in. But the structure was standing, and the horses were out, and none of the animals were dead. Her arms felt like rubber, and her face was raw from the cold and the heat cycling back and forth, and her coat smelled like smoke so heavily she thought she might never get it out. She sat on a fence rail in the gray pre-dawn and breathed. Silas came and stood near her, not right beside her, a few feet away, looking at what was left of the eastern wall. His face in the gray light was very still. He was doing the things she'd seen him do before, shutting down from the inside out, pulling everything back behind the wall. How'd it start? Hatch asked. The old man had materialized from the bunkhouse during the second hour and done what needed doing without being directed, which was Hatch's way. Don't know yet. Silas's voice was flat. East wall. It was... He stopped, looked at the burned section with focused attention. There was no lantern on that side. The silence that followed had weight. Someone would need to check what's left, Nora said quietly. In the morning. Silas turned away from the barn. Everyone get some sleep. She watched him go inside and she saw it, the slight change in how he carried himself, heavier at the shoulders, the particular posture of a man taking something on that he intends to carry alone. She knew that posture. She'd been watching it for weeks. What she did not know yet, what she couldn't have known standing in the cold gray morning with smoke in her hair and ash on her coat, was that the next weeks would test everything she'd built here, every small piece of trust she'd earned, every careful distance she'd crossed. that Silas Mercer, faced with something he couldn't control, would do the thing he knew how to do: turn inward, shut down, push away the thing that had gotten closest, and that she, faced with being pushed, would have to decide, again, as she'd decided once before on a train in Virginia, whether she was going to run or whether she was going to stay and fight for something that was hers. She looked at the smoking ruin of the eastern wall, and at the house where Eli was waiting, and at the sky going pale at the edges with the coming dawn. She was not running. She had not come this far to run. But she understood now, standing in the cold ash smell of a January morning, that the hardest fights were not always with men like Victor Hale. Sometimes the hardest fight was with a man who was trying to protect himself by dismantling the one thing that had started to matter. She went inside to make coffee. The coffee was ready before Eli came downstairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightclothes and boots, the carved horse clutched in one hand, his hair pressed flat on one side from his pillow. He looked at her face, ash-streaked, smoke-raw, exhausted, and didn't say anything for a moment. Just looked. "Is everyone okay?" he asked. "Everyone's okay," she said. "The horses are out. Nobody got hurt." He came and sat at the table, still holding the carved horse. She put a cup of warm milk in front of him and sat across from him with her coffee. And they didn't talk, which was one of the things she'd come to value about Eli. He was not a child who needed noise to feel safe. He just needed presence. She gave him presence and drank her coffee and let the silence be what it was. After a while, he said, "Papa's going to be angry." "He's already angry," she said. "That's different from wrong." Eli turned the carved horse over in his hands. "When Mama died, he got angry for a long time. At everything. At the fence posts and the weather and the horses." A pause. "Not at me, but I could feel it." She looked at him carefully. "Are you worried about that happening again?" He thought about it with the slow honesty of a child who took questions seriously. "A little," he said, "but—" Another pause. "You're here now. That's different." She didn't have a clean answer to that. She wanted to tell him it would be fine, that she'd make sure of it, that this particular kind of certainty was something she could offer him. But she'd made herself a rule early on about not promising children things she wasn't sure she could deliver, because children remembered promises with an exactness that adults usually underestimated. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, which was what she was actually sure of. He nodded and drank his milk. Silas spent the next 3 days inside the ruin of the east wall, going through what was left. She gave him room. She kept the house running, kept Eli steady, kept the ranch hands fed and working, and she waited. She was good at waiting. She'd had a lot of practice, but she watched the set of his shoulders each evening when he came in and understood that whatever he was finding in those burned boards, it was not making things easier. On the fourth morning, he told her what he'd found. He came in from the barn and set something on the kitchen table, a short length of scorched metal, cylindrical, the kind of thing you'd carry in a coat pocket. An oil flask. Empty, burned clean, the kind of container that had no business in the section of the barn where it was found, because there was no lantern and no lamp on that side of the structure. She looked at it for a long time. "Someone said it," she said. "Yes." "Hale. Can't prove it." His voice was controlled in the deliberate way of a man containing something that wants to move. His men were in Conifer the night it started. That's what people will say. That's what he'll say. No witnesses. No proof beyond that. He picked the flask up and set it down again. But yes, Hale. She sat with it. The shape of it, the full ugliness, that a man had ridden out to Stone Ridge Ranch on a January night and put fire to their barn, had stood in the cold and done it deliberately and ridden away and slept in a warm bed while they pumped water through freezing hands until dawn. Something moved through her that she recognized as rage, clean and specific, and she let herself feel it fully for one moment before she set it aside, because rage was useful in small doses and corrosive in large ones, and she had work to do. "What are our options?" she said. He looked at her. The containment in his face cracked slightly, not breaking, just showing the pressure underneath. "I don't know that we have many. We have more than it feels like right now. Nora." He said her name the way people say names when they're tired of being argued with, and aren't ready yet to admit the argument is right. The barn repair is going to cost what we don't have. Hale knows that. He set the fire to put us in exactly this position, and He stopped. His jaw worked. I should have been more careful. I should have had someone watching. You couldn't have known. I should have known. He pushed back from the table and stood. I knew what he was. I knew what he was willing to do, and I didn't. He stopped again, moved to the window, stood with his back to her. Clara died because I didn't take care of something I should have. The fever spread through the area, and I thought it would miss us because I wanted to think that. I didn't get the doctor soon enough. And now this. The kitchen was very quiet. She hadn't known that. Not the full shape of it, not the blame he'd been carrying since Clara died. She sat with it for a moment because it deserved a moment. Silas, she kept her voice level, a fever that moved through a whole county is not something you failed to prevent. You know that. I know what I know, he said, which was the answer of a man who had decided on a version of events and lived inside it long enough that logic wasn't the right tool to reach him. And the fire? You didn't set it. A man who wants your land set it. Those are different things. He turned from the window. His face was doing what it did when the wall was fully up. Closed, controlled. The grief and the anger locked behind something harder. I need you to take Eli to town, he said. Stay with Harriet for a while, until this is settled. She looked at him. No. Nora, I said no. She stood up. I'm not taking Eli to hide in town while you deal with this alone, and I'm not leaving because things have gotten hard, and I'm not... Silas, I am your wife. I am not a thing you put somewhere safe when the situation is difficult. You could get hurt. The control slipped slightly. He already burned the barn. If he decides to come after the house or the family directly, you need more people here, not fewer. She held his gaze. I understand you're scared. I understand you've lost things before and you don't want to lose anything else. But pushing me away is not protecting me. It's just you being alone again, which is exactly what Hale wants. A man alone and on the defensive loses. You know that. The silence that followed was long enough that she wasn't sure which way it was going to break. He stood by the window and looked at her with an expression that was fighting itself. The grief and the need pulling one direction and the habit of solitude pulling the other. I don't know how to do this differently, he said finally. It came out stripped of the control he usually maintained, just the plain fact of it. I know, she said. That's why I'm here. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he sat back down at the table. He didn't say anything else, but he sat down, which was enough. The solution to the barn came from Harriet Hanley, which Nora should have expected because Harriet Hanley was the kind of woman who had solutions and was waiting to be asked. Nora rode into town 2 days later, alone, and sat across from Harriet in the back of the general store where the woman kept a small office that looked like a tornado had organized it. Papers everywhere, but apparently in some system only Harriet understood, because she could locate anything in under 30 seconds. She told Harriet the situation, all of it, the fire, the oil flask, the barn repair costs, the financial margin they were already working inside, and Victor Hale's pattern of manufactured crises designed to make ranchers feel like they were out of options. Harriet listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. The barn, she said when Nora finished. How much of the structure is standing? 3 walls solid. East wall needs full replacement, part of the roof. The frame is intact. Harriet thought. There's a barn-raising tradition in this county that hasn't been used in about 4 years, since the Kellerman family lost their structure. The community comes together. The materials are bought on cooperative credit through the Merchants Association, which I chair, and the labor is donated. She looked at Nora. Silas never asked for it because Silas never asks for anything. He won't like asking now, Nora said. He doesn't have to ask. You do. Harriet's eyes were direct and practical. That's not weakness, that's arithmetic. The barn gets rebuilt faster, at lower cost, and every family that participates has a stake in Stone Ridge staying Stone Ridge. Victor Hale finds it harder to move against a ranch that the whole community has just invested in. Nora sat with that. The elegance of it. Practical and social at once. The solution hiding in plain sight. He'll see what we're doing. Of course he will. That's rather the point. She rode home with the framework of a plan, and the specific, careful satisfaction of someone who had found the edge of a problem and begun to see around it. Silas listened to this barn-raising proposal that evening with the expression of a man being told something that made sense and conflicted with his instincts in equal measure. "People will talk," he said. "People are already talking," she said. "Let them talk about the barn raising. It looks like charity. It looks like community, which is what it is." She paused. "Harriet said the Kellermans didn't lose anything by accepting it. They're still running." He was quiet for a moment. "It should have been me thinking of this. It was me thinking of it. That shouldn't bother you." He looked at her across the table. "It doesn't bother me," he said slowly, like he was confirming it to himself. "That's what's strange." She didn't say anything to that, but something shifted slightly in the room. Not a dramatic shift, just the small movement of two people adjusting the distance between them. "Talk to Harriet," she said. "Tomorrow." He did. The barn raising happened on a Saturday in late January, 22 people showing up at Stone Ridge in the early morning with tools and lumber and the organized energy of a community that knows how to do a thing and does it without ceremony. Nora fed them, all of them, the whole day, with Wade and Dell helping carry and Eli delivering bread to the workers, with the serious efficiency of a boy who had been given an important job and intended to do it right. She worked beside the women who came with the men because that was how barn raisings worked. The men built, and the women fed, and everyone went home tired and satisfied. Beverly Croft was there, notably, and kept her particular smile at a lower wattage than usual, possibly because the barn raising was not a situation that rewarded open hostility toward the woman running it. The two women from the general store, the ones who had said any port in a storm, were also there. One of them, a Mrs. Aldrich, came to Nora mid-morning and said without preamble, "That's good cornbread," which was not an apology but was adjacent to one, in the way that small-town gestures toward reconciliation often are. "Thank you," Nora said, and handed her another piece. By end of day, the east wall was framed and half-boarded, and the roofline was staked. Silas stood at the edge of the yard as the families loaded up their wagons to go home, shaking hands, saying the words he needed to say in the particular way of a man who found gratitude difficult, but was doing it anyway because it was right. She watched him from the porch and thought about what Hatch had said. He built this whole place around her being in it, and thought about how you rebuild something that was built for one person when the situation has changed. You rebuild it differently. Not worse, just differently, for what it is now. Coop came and stood beside her on the porch. The first time he'd voluntarily positioned himself at her shoulder for something other than work. "Good thinking," he said, looking at the half-built wall. "The barn raising." "Harriet's thinking," she said. "Harriet had the idea. You're the one who went and got it." He was quiet for a moment. Silas wasn't going to ask. No. Someone needed to. Yes. He nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd decided something, and went to help put tools away. She understood that this was, from Coop, the equivalent of a formal declaration of alliance. She took it as it was given and felt the accumulated weight of the past weeks shift slightly, not lifting, but redistributing, spreading across more points of support. She found the connection to Hale's other dealings on a Wednesday afternoon, in the county land records office, where she had no particular standing to be, but where the clerk, a young man named Obadiah, who was bored enough with his work that an interested visitor was genuinely welcome, let her look through the public filings while she explained she was researching the region's land history. She was looking for the pattern. She'd been thinking about it since the falsified survey, about a man who operated through manufactured paperwork and legal ambiguity, who built his acquisitions on other people's inability to verify documents. She wanted to know how many times he'd done it before. She wanted to know the shape of his method. She found 4 other properties in Conifer County that had transferred to Hale's various company names in the past 7 years, and in 3 of those 4 cases, the transfer had followed either a legal dispute or a financial crisis. 2 of the previous owners were still in the county. She wrote down their names and thanked Obadiah and rode home in the late afternoon cold with the list in her coat pocket and a cleaner picture in her head. She found Silas in the newly framed barn, running his hand along the new timber, checking joints with the focused physical attention of a man who needed to know with his hands. She stood at the barn door and let him finish what he was doing. I found something in the county records, she said when he came over. She laid it out for him. The 4 properties, the pattern, the 2 former owners still in the county. He listened the way he'd been learning to listen, not waiting for the gap to refill with his own response, but actually tracking what she said. Whitfield, he said when she mentioned the first name. Tom Whitfield. He's over on the Umber Creek Road. Had a good cattle operation, lost it in a water rights dispute 4 years ago. Hale's dispute. Yes, he thought. And the Donahue family. They're in town now. Frank Donahue drives the supply wagon. If they're willing to talk about what happened, willing to put it on record, the pattern across multiple properties makes the falsified survey more than an isolated incident. It becomes a method, a documented method. She looked at him steadily. That's something a county sheriff or a federal land office could act on. Silas was quiet for a long moment. You want me to talk to Tom Whitfield? I want us to talk to Tom Whitfield and Frank Donahue. She held his gaze. I know it's asking them to stand up against someone who already took things from them. I know that's not a small ask, but they might be willing if they understand what it means. He looked at her for a moment, the long, clear look that he gave things when he was seeing them without the defensive equipment he usually kept in place. You've been working on this, he said, this whole time. Since the first visit, she said. When he rode up the drive and I saw how he looked at this place, she paused. Some men look at a thing and see what it is. Some look at it and only see what they could get for it. He's the second kind. Silas nodded slowly. I'll ride to Whitfield's tomorrow. We'll ride, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face had changed in the past weeks. Not that the wall was gone, but that he'd started leaving a door in it, a space where she could come and go without the whole structure having to shift. It was imperfect and incomplete, and it was, she thought, about as much as she could have reasonably hoped for from a man who'd been building that wall for 2 years. We'll ride, he said. Tom Whitfield was a leathered man of about 50 who took a long time opening his door and a longer time deciding to trust them, which was reasonable given what Hale had already taken from him. He listened to Nora explain what she'd found in the county records with the careful attention of someone hearing an account of their own wound from a new angle. When she finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. You found the instrument discrepancy, he said, on the survey. Yes, I knew something was wrong with it. His voice had a thin, old anger in it. I knew it, but I didn't know what, and by the time I could have had it looked at, the legal costs were already more than I could carry. He looked at Silas. He knew that. He knew exactly how long to drag it out so a man runs out of money to fight. Would you be willing to put that on record? Nora asked. What happened? The survey, the timeline, the costs. If it's documented alongside the same pattern in other cases, there's something to bring to the federal land office. Whitfield looked at her directly for the first time. He had the kind of eyes that had seen enough to be difficult to read, but she held his gaze without backing off, and after a moment he nodded once, the slow, final nod of a man who has decided. Yes, he said. I'll put it on record. Frank Donahue, whom they found that same afternoon, was angrier and took less convincing. He'd been angrier for 4 years, she could see. It had nowhere to go and had turned into something slightly corrosive, the anger of a man who had accepted that justice was not coming and had stopped expecting it. When she laid out what she was building, the documentation, the pattern, the federal angle, he looked at her with the slightly stunned expression of someone who'd been told a door they thought was sealed might still open. What are the odds, he said, that this actually goes anywhere? She thought about giving him an optimistic answer and decided against it. I don't know, she said, but I know that the alternative is Hale continues as he has, and eventually he'll find another family in the position yours was in, or the Whitfields were in, or we're in right now. She paused. The documentation doesn't guarantee the outcome, but without it, the outcome is certain. He chewed on that for a long moment. Silas sat beside her and said nothing, which was the right call. This was a conversation that needed to come from her, not from the man whose ranch was currently at stake and who had a more obvious personal interest in the outcome. All right, Donahue said finally. What do you need from me? Well, Victor Hale appeared at Stone Ridge for the 3rd time on a morning in early February, and this time he came alone except for the lawyer Birch, and the energy around him was different, less patient, a man who had expected a certain process to be moving faster and was coming to apply pressure. Nora was the one who answered the door. Silas was behind her in the front room, and Coop and Hatch were visible in the yard doing nothing in particular, which was deliberate. "Mrs. Mercer," Hale said. He was looking at her with the full attention he'd been withholding in prior visits. The reassessment she'd earned. "Is your husband available?" "He is," she said. "As am I." A flicker of something in his expression. "This is a legal matter." "Then you can say it to both of us, since it concerns us both." She stepped back. "Come in." He came in, and Birch came in behind him, and Silas came to stand beside her, and the four of them stood in the front room of Stone Ridge Ranch, while the February cold pressed against the windows, and the wood stove put out its steady heat. Hale looked around the room with the measuring eyes of a man pricing furniture. Then he said, "I'll make this simple. The barn repair costs put you in a difficult position. I'm prepared to offer a fair price for the property and allow you to remain as a leaseholder for up to 2 years. The offer won't be better if you wait." Silas started to speak. Nora touched his arm briefly and he stopped. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I filed a summary of evidence with the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne 11 days ago. It documents the falsified survey you submitted on this property, with the instrument discrepancy, alongside records from 3 other Conifer County properties where similar methods were used, and sworn statements from 2 former landowners regarding their experience." She watched his face. "The filing includes a request for investigation. These things take time, but they do move eventually." The silence in the room changed quality. Birch was very still. Hale's expression did not collapse. He was too practiced for that. But something left it. The ease, the particular relaxed confidence of a man who was accustomed to being in control of the shape of things. What replaced it was careful and calculating in a less comfortable way. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held the look without flinching, without backing up, without performing anything. Just looked back. "That's a serious allegation," he said, the same words as before. "It's a documented pattern," she said. "The allegation belongs to the Federal Land Office. We just provided the evidence." He looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him with the level, unafraid steadiness of a man who had run out of things to lose. "She speaks for both of us," Silas said. Another long silence. Hale's eyes moved around the room. The house, the yard visible through the window, Coop and Hatch in the yard. Something working behind his eyes. "I see," he said finally. And then, "Good day, Mrs. Mercer." Turned to Silas. "Mr. Mercer." He walked out. Birch followed, and by the look on Birch's face, he was going to have words with his client that Hale was not going to enjoy. Nora stood at the window and watched them ride away. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with a kind of distant surprise. She'd expected them to shake, the way they'd shaken after the first confrontation on the porch. But there was nothing trembling in her now, just the solid, unremarkable fact of having done what she came here to do. Silas stood beside her at the window, close enough that she was aware of the heat of him in the cold room. Neither of them spoke for a while. "He'll be careful for a while," she said. "The federal filing makes direct action too risky. He'll look for softer targets. He'll come back eventually," Silas said. "Men like that don't stop." "No, but we'll be ready for whatever comes next." She turned from the window. "We should send word to Whitfield and Donahue. Tell them what happened." Silas was looking at her with that open expression, the one without the wall's full architecture in front of it. He said, "Why did you do this?" "All of it. You didn't have to." She looked at him. "This is my home," she said. "That's why." The word sat between them, home, and she watched it land, watched him receive it, watched something work through his face that was too complicated to name and too real to look away from. Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway in his school coat, ready for the morning. He looked between them. "Did the man leave?" "He left," Nora said. Eli thought about it. "Is he coming back?" "Maybe," she said honestly, "but we'll handle it if he does." Eli nodded with the gravity of a boy who had decided to trust that. Then, "Is breakfast ready?" Silas made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was closer than she'd heard from him in weeks. "Go sit down," he said. "We'll get breakfast." They went to the kitchen. Outside, the February cold pressed its clean white weight against the windows. and the ranch sat solid and present under the sky. And Nora put the pan on the stove and got to work. The federal investigation moved the way all official things moved, slowly, with long silences between each small development, requiring patience from people who had already spent most of theirs. March came and the snow started its gradual retreat from the lower elevations, and Nora learned to read that particular kind of waiting, the kind where you've done everything you can do, and the outcome is now in other hands, and all that's left is to keep living in the meantime. She kept living. That was something she'd always been good at. The hay sale to the Hendersons went through in late February at better prices than either of them had projected because the winter had been harder on the northern ranches and demand had driven the price up. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was enough to breathe differently, to approach the spring with a margin they hadn't had in January. She updated the account columns she'd been maintaining and showed them to Silas, and he looked at the numbers and looked at her and said, "Good," in the way he said things when he meant considerably more than the word itself. The east barn wall was finished in early March, the last boards going up on a Tuesday afternoon while Eli stood in the yard watching with the carved horse in his pocket. When Coop drove the final nail and stepped back, Eli looked at the wall for a moment and then at Nora. "It looks right now," he said. "It does," she agreed. She meant the barn. She was fairly sure he meant something larger. Gima. Silas broke in the spring, which was the right word for it. Not broke down, not broke apart, but the way river ice breaks in March, when the temperature has been doing its invisible work for weeks, and then one morning the whole surface shifts and moves, and the water underneath is suddenly visible. It happened on a Sunday evening when Eli was asleep, and the house was quiet with the specific quiet that comes after a long day of physical work, when the body is tired enough that the mind loses its normal defenses. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the account papers between them, the lamp burning low. She'd been going through the numbers for the spring cattle plan, and he'd been there, present in the way he'd gotten used to being present, contributing, following her logic, adding the things she didn't know about the land and the herd. The conversation had wound down naturally, and they'd been sitting in the comfortable silence that had replaced the careful silence of earlier months. He said, without looking up from the table, "I don't know how to do this right." She looked at him. "Clara and I—" He stopped, started again, with the careful pace of a man saying something for the first time that he's been not saying for a long time. "We knew each other since we were children. I never had to learn her. She was already there. And when she wasn't anymore, I didn't know how to—" His hand rested flat on the table. "I built everything for a life that wasn't coming back, and I couldn't figure out how to want anything different." She waited. "You came and you—" He looked up. His face was open in the way she'd seen in flashes, but never held this long. "You didn't ask me to be different. You just worked with what was here, and I didn't know how to let that be what it was." "What is it?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp put a warm, unsteady light across the table, and outside the March wind moved around the house with the searching quality of early spring, and she could hear the horses in the rebuilt barn and Eli's small, steady breathing through the wall. "Something I want," he said, "that I didn't expect to want again." She looked at him, not the careful look, not the measured one, just directly, with the fullness of what she actually felt, which she had been keeping at a responsible distance for months, because she had not known, had genuinely not known, whether what she was building here was real or was just the outline of real, the shape of a life without the actual substance. She said, "I'm not Clara. I know that. I'm not going to be her. I'm not going to fit into the space she was in." She said it clearly, without apology. "I'm something different. Whatever we build here is going to look different than what you had before." "I know that too," he said. "I think—" He paused. "I think that might be all right." It was not a declaration. It was not romantic in any of the ways she'd have been told romance was supposed to work. It was a man with a wall around himself admitting that the wall had a door in it, and he was choosing to leave it open, and to Nora Whitmore, who had spent 28 years being practical about what she was worth and careful about what she let herself need, it was more than enough. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything else. And the lamp burned on, and outside the Wyoming night did what Wyoming nights did, large and cold and indifferent to the small human warmth inside the house. which made that warmth feel more, rather than less, significant. The letter from the Federal Land Office came on a Wednesday in April, when the last of the snow was gone from the lower pastures and the first green was showing in the south field. The postmaster's boy brought it out to the ranch in the morning, and Nora took it from him and stood on the porch and opened it. She read it twice. Then she went inside and found Silas at the kitchen table eating his breakfast, and she put the letter in front of him. He read it. His expression did its internal negotiation, the way it did when something significant was happening, and he was processing it faster than he was showing it. The Federal Land Office had completed its preliminary review of the evidence submitted. It had found sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation into Victor Hale's land acquisition practices in Conifer County, with particular attention to the preparation and submission of fraudulent survey documents. Hale had been formally notified. All pending legal claims against properties in the county connected to Hale's companies were suspended pending the investigation's completion. It was not a verdict. It was not a guarantee. The letter was careful to make clear that the investigation's outcome was not predetermined and could take a year or more to resolve. But it was official, it was documented, and Victor Hale now had a federal investigation into his business practices where before he had had none. Silas set the letter down. He looked at it on the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "Whitfield and Donahue did this. Harriet did this." She sat down across from him. "You did this by not selling when it would have been easier." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about it," he said. "After the fire, I thought about taking his offer." She knew. She'd seen it in him. The moment of exhaustion when the easiest path looks like the only path. She hadn't said anything then because it wasn't her moment to manage. It was his. "But you didn't," she said. "You wouldn't let me," he said. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not quite lightness, but adjacent to it, like a man remembering how to have a sense of humor about his own stubbornness. "I didn't let you do anything," she said. "I argued with you. You made the choice." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I did." She got up and poured coffee, and they sat with the letter on the table between them. And outside, the April morning was doing what April mornings do in Wyoming, going back and forth between winter and spring, not quite deciding, the sky running through 3 kinds of light in an hour. Eli came downstairs in his school clothes and saw them at the table and saw the letter, and came close enough to read the official letterhead. "Is it good?" he asked. "It's good," Silas said. Eli absorbed this for a moment. Then, "Can I have biscuits?" Nora laughed. A real laugh, sudden and uncomplicated. It startled all 3 of them slightly, the way genuine laughter does when it's been a while. "Yes," she said. "You can have biscuits, Aunt." She rode into Conifer that afternoon. Not for anything specific. She had a list of supplies, but the list was an excuse. She went because she wanted to. Because it was her town in the way it hadn't been when she arrived. When it was a foreign country where people looked at her and made their calculations and decided what she was before she'd had a chance to show them anything. Things were different now, and she knew it, and she didn't feel superior about it because she understood what it had cost to make it different. Not one dramatic gesture, not one confrontation. The porch boards and the horse's stone and the hay sale and the account columns and the falsified survey's instrument discrepancy and the barn raising and Whitfield and Donahue and 100 small, consistent, ordinary acts of a woman who showed up every day and did what needed doing and did not stop when things were hard. Harriet was behind her counter when Nora came in. She looked at Nora's face and read it. "Good news," she said. "Federal investigation opened." Nora put her list on the counter. Harriet said nothing for a moment, processing this with the still satisfaction of someone who had expected a certain outcome and was not surprised to see it arriving. Then she said, "Tom Whitfield will be relieved." "I'm going to tell him on the way home." "You should." Harriet began pulling supplies. "Beverly Croft asked me about you last week," she said, in the mildly informational tone she used when she was telling you something that had more layers than it appeared to. "What did she ask?" "Whether you were planning to stay." Harriet set a sack of flour on the counter. "Permanently." Nora looked at her. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that seemed like the wrong question." Harriet looked back at her with the direct eyes that didn't waste time on indirection. Stone Ridge is your home. People don't plan to stay in their own homes. They're just there. Nora stood with that for a moment. Something settled in her chest, quiet and final, like the last piece of something clicking into its correct position after a long time of being slightly wrong. That's the right answer, she said. Harriet made a sound that was her version of agreement and kept pulling supplies. Outside, Mrs. Aldrich thought the woman from the cornbread incident, the any port in a storm woman, passed the window, saw Nora through the glass, and lifted a hand in greeting. Not effusive, not overly warm, just a hand lifted, an acknowledgement between people who occupied the same town and had reached an understanding about it. Nora lifted hers back. Spring moved into summer, and summer was hard and good, in the way that working seasons are hard and good. The physical satisfaction of productive labor, the daily problems that required daily solutions, the rhythm of a life that needed you to show up completely or not at all. The cattle yield came back strong. Not 30%, as she'd projected in her optimistic column, but closer to 40, which gave them a buffer going into fall that they'd never had before, and which Silas regarded with a complicated relief, the kind that comes when things go right after a long time of them going wrong, and you're not quite sure yet if you're allowed to trust it. She helped him trust it, when she could. That was part of what she was learning. Not just the ranching, not just the finances, not just the management of a household in a hard country, but the work of being present to a man who had been alone inside himself for so long the company still felt slightly foreign. It was not always easy. He was still capable of going quiet in a way that shut out everything around him, still capable of retreating when he was overwhelmed in ways he couldn't articulate. She was not always patient. She pushed sometimes when she should have waited, and waited sometimes when she should have pushed, and they had arguments, real ones, not the careful disagreements of people still performing civility, but the blunt, sometimes ugly arguments of people who had let each other close enough for friction to be real. One of them, in July, was bad enough that she went out to sit on the porch in the dark for an hour, because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't the same room as him. He came out after a while and sat on the step below her, which put them at an odd angle but kept them both outside, which was apparently where they needed to be. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I know that," she said. You're not easy either." She looked at the back of his head. "I know that too." He was quiet for a while. "I don't want you to go." "I'm not going," she said. "I'm sitting on the porch." "I mean," he stopped, started again. "I mean, ever. I don't want you to go ever." He turned slightly, enough that she could see the side of his face. I should have said that before now. She thought about 28 years of being invisible, about the form her sisters filled out as a joke, about the train platform in Conifer and the first look he'd given her, and the particular courage it had taken to hold her chin level through that assessment, about porch boards and bean soup and a small carved figure on a windowsill and the weight of a child asleep against her arm. "You're saying it now," she said. He turned fully and looked at her in the dark. "I love you," he said. Plainly, without preparation, the way he said things when he'd decided to say them and saw no point in elaborate construction. "I didn't know how to say that or whether I had the right to, but that's what it is." She looked at him for a moment. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying to be practical about it for months." Something crossed his face that she realized, with a slight start, was the closest she had ever seen him come to genuine amusement. "Were you successful?" "Not especially," she admitted. He reached up and took her hand where it rested on the porch rail, and she let him, and they sat there in the Wyoming summer dark with the ranch quiet around them and the stars doing what Wyoming stars do, filling the sky completely, too many to make sense of, the kind of sight that makes you feel small and present in equal measure. The federal investigation into Victor Hale's land practices concluded the following January, 14 months after Nora had filed the initial evidence summary, with findings that resulted in the invalidation of 2 of his fraudulent surveys, substantial financial penalties, and the permanent revocation of his ability to conduct land transactions in 3 Wyoming counties, including Conifer. Whitfield and Donahue received official documentation clearing the record of their former properties' transfers, though the properties themselves were not returned. That was a limitation of what the law could actually do, and Nora had been honest with both men about that from the beginning. Tom Whitfield came to Stone Ridge the week the news came out. He was not a demonstrative man. He and Silas were alike in that. But he sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and said to Nora directly, "What you built out of those records, what you did with it." He stopped. "I'd given up on that kind of thing being possible." "I almost did too," she said, "but you didn't." "No." She refilled his cup. "I was angry enough not to." He nodded like that made complete sense, which it did, and drank his coffee. Hale left Conifer County shortly after the findings were published. She didn't know where he went, and she didn't spend time thinking about it. Men like Victor Hale found other places to operate in. The investigation had constrained him here, in this county, and that would have to be enough, because she had a ranch to run, and she couldn't spend her life following a man's retreat. What mattered was Stone Ridge. What mattered was the stack of accounts on the kitchen table showing a ranch in its best financial position in 4 years. What mattered was Eli at 8 years old, taller and less grave than he'd been at 6, still carrying carved figures in his pockets, but now making them for other people too. A horse for Hatch, a dog for Wade, a small bird he gave to Nora one morning without explanation, and which joined the figure of herself on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. What mattered was Coop, who by the end of the second year addressed her opinions in ranch meetings as straightforwardly as he addressed Silas's, and who had stopped waiting for Silas's confirmation before acting on anything she said. What mattered was Harriet Hanley introducing her at the County Merchants Association spring meeting, a meeting Harriet had proposed Nora attend, and then proposed she address, and then simply told her she was addressing, as Nora Mercer, Stone Ridge Ranch, with the plain assumption that everyone in the room knew who that was. They did. She wrote to her mother in Virginia regularly because she was that kind of daughter. The letters were practical in the way her life was practical. News of the ranch, Eli's growth, the account of the Hale investigation. Her mother wrote back in her careful hand, asking questions that showed she read carefully, sending small things occasionally. A packet of seeds, a recipe card, once a photograph of the Virginia hills that Nora put on the bedroom wall where she could see it from the bed. She wrote to her sisters less often. When she did, the letters were shorter. She did not tell them about Hale, or the fire, or the federal investigation, not because she wanted to keep it from them, but because the shape of her life had moved so far from the context in which they could understand it that explanation felt exhausting. She told them Eli was growing fast. She told them the ranch was doing well. She told them the winters were hard. Celeste wrote back once, asking if she was happy. She sat with the question for a full day before she answered it, because it deserved an honest answer, and happiness was a more complicated word than people usually treated it as. She was not happy in the frictionless, uncomplicated way of people who had arranged their lives to avoid difficulty. Her life had difficulty in it, and always would. This country, this work, this man who was still learning to leave his wall's door open, this child who still sometimes woke from bad dreams and came to find her in the kitchen and needed hot milk and presents without questions. None of it was easy. None of it was the life that anyone looking at Nora Whitmore at 28 would have predicted or designed for her. She wrote back, "Yes, but not the way I thought it would look." That felt true enough. Pocket. 3 years after she stepped off the train at Conifer Station, with her Virginia boots and her carpet bag and her heart in her throat, Stone Ridge Ranch was one of the more stable operations in Conifer County. Not the largest, not the most prosperous, but solid in the way of things that have been tested and held. The east barn wall standing straight, the south pasture's drainage finally addressed after she'd spent 2 seasons pestering Silas about it, the cattle herd at numbers that provided genuine security, and the account columns balanced in a way that let her sleep through the night. She was the one who started bringing Eli to the county land office to watch how the records were filed, because she'd decided that a boy growing up on this land should know how it was documented, what the legal language meant, where the vulnerabilities were, and how to protect against them. He was a solemn, attentive student. He had her habit of remembering useful things. Silas caught them at the kitchen table one evening working through the county surveying manual Harriet had tracked down for her, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching without them knowing he was there. When she looked up and saw him, he had the open expression, the one without the wall, and something underneath it that she'd learned to recognize as the particular feeling of a man who had gotten more than he knew how to ask for and was still slightly surprised to find it real. "Supper ready?" he asked, which was not what he meant. "Almost," she said, which was not what she meant either. Eli didn't look up from the manual. The instrument section is confusing, he said. Yes, she said, looking back at the page. It is. That's why we're going through it twice. Silas went to the stove to check the pot, and she could hear him moving around the kitchen behind her, the familiar sounds of a man comfortable in his own space. And outside, the Wyoming evening was going gold over the mountains, the light doing what it did at that hour, turning everything it touched into something that looked briefly exactly like enough. She was not the woman anyone had designed this life for. She had not been selected, or destined, or set apart. She had been a joke, initially, a name on a form filled out over wine by sisters who loved her carelessly and never imagined anyone would answer. She had arrived in this country overweight and overlooked, and already 28 years practiced at being invisible, and she had decided, without any guarantee, without any promise of outcome, that she was done being invisible. That was the whole of it. That was the decision that made everything else possible. Not talent, not beauty, not luck. Just the hard, unglamorous choice to stop disappearing and to take up the full space of her own life, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was difficult, even when the land and the town and the man himself pushed back. She put her hand on the page where Eli was reading and pointed to the passage that explained instrument certification. Start here, she said. Read it out loud. It makes more sense when you hear it. He started reading. Silas put a bowl of something on the table beside her without interrupting. She reached over without looking and squeezed his hand once, briefly, and he squeezed back before going to set the rest of the table. Outside, Stone Ridge sat under its enormous sky, solid and present and entirely itself. The mountains held their permanent snow. The cattle moved in the south pasture. The rebuilt barn stood with its new eastern wall straight and true, and the weather-vane rooster on the roof turned in the evening wind, still there, still keeping its mild iron sense of humor about the whole enterprise of trying to make a life in a hard country. They were still trying. They were still there. That, Nora had decided, was the whole point.